So anyway, we have questions in the comments. So Oilfield Guy wants to know, the Supreme Court case involving personhood of corporations and campaign contributions. How do you see the potential outcome of this decision? Are you familiar with it?
It's I don't have any special insights as to what the Supreme Court will do, but it's actually a very, very interesting issue. What a corporation is, because corporations are creation of the state. I mean, it's not. This is the libertarians should agree with us on this. I mean, if you don't like the government, well, government creates corporations. Corporations aren't out there in nature. Nature, you or I could form a partnership, and we can make lots of money maybe. But if we end up, spewing poison and killing kids, well, we're going to get sued and owe everything we ever had. Well, instead, the state lets us create, Jane and Dean's corporation, and they sue Jane and Dean's corporation. That goes bankrupt. We walk off rich. Well, that's a creation of the state. That's not, nature. And in terms of, corporate free speech, well, that's up to the government to decide. It's not. You or I can say whatever we want, and that's the Constitution, that's the First Amendment, that's free speech. If we say, Exxon, because it's a corporation, they don't have the right to, go out and campaign for McCain or whoever they want. Well, that's not limiting free speech. Anyone who wants to could do whatever they want to promote John McCain. It's just that anyone who gets this special privilege from the government, the corporation, they don't have that right. So, the corporation doesn't, that is, I should say. So, I mean, that's, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not on the Supreme Court, but, to my mind, there really isn't a constitutional issue in terms of restricting the speech of corporations.
Mark, there's a beginner in the comments said that he worked on your congressional campaign in 1992 in Urbana.
Oh, that's nice. Thank you very much for your support. It was...
and if you'd only worked harder...
well, it was a very close primary.
You could be stealing from... so, let's see. The Wall Street, Masaccio says, the Wall Street Journal is just one of the papers writing about the shadow foreclosure problem. Let's see. Houses that are not being foreclosed now but will be later. What do you think is the best way to deal with the huge overhang that exists and might be coming down the road?
That's yours, that foreclosure.
Yeah. Well, I think the most immediate thing we want to do is try and keep people in their homes. And here, too, I think there's actually a very simple way to do it, which is getting a little interest in Congress, getting more interest in Congress. Dick Durbin, among others, has come out in support of it, is this idea of giving people the right to rent. So if you're facing foreclosure, you would have the right, post-foreclosure, homeowner would have the right to stay in their house as a tenant paying the market rent for a substantial period of time. I'd like the substantial to be longer rather than shorter, say 10 years, maybe even longer. If you got 5 years, that would at least be a good start. What that would do, a few things. One is it gives people security in their house. So if they like the home, they like the schools, they like the neighborhood, they get to stay there. They lose ownership of the house, but they do get to stay there. They're not out on the street. The second thing that I think is very important, if we want to keep people as homeowners, this might actually be the best way, because it makes foreclosure a much less attractive option for banks, because they don't own the house free and clear. They could sell it, but the tenant goes with it. So if you have a right to stay there for 5 years, you still have that right even if they sell the house. It also keeps the house occupied. The worst possible thing is to have a neighborhood, as you do in many places, filled with all these vacant homes that have been foreclosed, and they aren't maintained. Sometimes they have squatters in there, they're drug houses. So it's really the worst possible world. So this is a very simple thing, and it's one of these cases where I actually wrote about this a couple years ago, and the first people I found getting behind me, maybe this should scare me, were Republicans. Desmond Lockman, who's a former IMF economist, who's at the American Enterprise Institute, he wrote about this. I never had even met the guy, but someone sent me what he'd written. So he thought it was a good way to deal with it. And Andrew Samwick, who was one of the top economists at Bush administration, co-authored a column with me on it, because I think it's just kind of a simple way. I mean, there's all these proposals to have modifications, which end up being very complicated, and I very often worry that the main beneficiaries of the modifications are the banks rather than the homeowners. Whereas in this case, we're not going to help the banks. This is something that helps the homeowners. It's very quick, doesn't require any bureaucracy, and it doesn't require any taxpayer dollars. So we can tell all those, the town hallers, we're not taking any of their money.
Let's rock on. So, Mark, what issues are not being discussed at the G20 that should be on the agenda?
Well, there's a lot. There's quite a lot.
If you were running the G20.
Yeah, where do we start? I mean, the poor countries have definitely gotten the shaft. You know, the IMF's getting hundreds of billions of dollars, and very, very little. I mean, there's a part that has gone to poor countries. That's the, you know, and you know, when you said the IMF is not the Fed, this year it did take a step towards being a little bit more like a Fed in the sense they did create $283 billion of what are called special drawing rights, which turns into real money for all the governments in the world. Now, unfortunately, the money you get is proportional to your quota at the IMF, so it's not so much for the poor countries, but it's still significant. But the main thing they really have screwed the poor countries is they're offering almost nothing of debt cancellation.
Right.
So you have a lot of countries in Africa, a lot of the poor countries have been hit very hard by the world recession. They were very dependent on exports for their growth over the last decade. And they still have sizable debt burdens, you know, some of them spending more on healthcare and more on debt service than they are in healthcare and education, for example. Very poor countries with AIDS crises. And, you know, you don't see, I mean, imagine the amount of resources we're talking about, you know. I mean, you're trying to get $1 trillion it's trillion with a T, for the IMF, and we can't even get, you know, when we were fighting in Congress, remember?
We
We were trying to get a lousy $4 billion out of that that's you know, not even 0.5%.
It was a good fight, though.
For the poor country debt relief, and they wouldn't even give us that.
Yeah.
And so I think that's one thing that's really not on their agenda. I mean, the G20, you know, people are expecting way too much from it. You know, it's not. It's not even like the G7 in the 1980s, where you know, you had 1985, a coordinated policy to bring down the value of the dollar with respect to other currencies. I mean, you don't even have that level of coordination. So people who think these problems are going to be solved internationally, primarily internationally, I think that's another fundamental mistake that we don't make, you know. And it's not that hard to figure this out. I mean, if you think about it, you know, the G20 is, first of all, it is really still the G7 with some other countries sitting in, you know. Secondly, you know, and the real institutions of power are like the IMF, which is run mainly by Treasury, the World Bank, which is also run mainly by Treasury, and the WTO, which is, you know, because it was created 50 years later, the developing countries do have a voice, but they have a veto power, but still the it's still concentrated in the rich countries, and the rules of the WTO are set up overwhelmingly for the rich countries and their corporations. You know, there's no doubt about that. And, you know, we could talk about that for hours. But the point is, these are the global institutions we have that have power and that actually exist. The G20, what does that leave the G20? That leaves it a place where talk really takes place. And even, you know, the kind of things that the G7 did in the 80s, you would need China. You need them to treat China as an equal power if you're going to, that's the second largest economy in the world. If you're going to do something about the global imbalances, that's what they're talking about right now. Even the IMF says we have to do something about these global imbalances. Well, okay, fine. But that means the dollar is overvalued. So you're going to bring down the dollar? Okay, but the U.S. Treasury says, you know, we have a strong dollar policy, right? So what's that, you know? And they're always worried that China's going to dump off its dollars and send the dollar down. And then at the same time, they're saying that China is undervaluing their currency. Well, that's two logically contradictory things. So you've got no coherent program and no means or willingness, I would say willingness, because if they really wanted to, they could get together and they could help resolve the global imbalances by bringing currencies somewhat out of the misalignment that they're in today, but they're not going to do it.
Okay, so speaking of China, person 1597 says, okay, when does China's debt bubble invert? According to the Financial Times, non-performing loans are rising sharply while some bank reserves are several points below guidance, 10%. This is the formula for insolvency. My guess is that they have less than a year before debt service fails to keep up. There is no Republican, the economy is strong mythology on this unfolding scenario. Maybe it is because Republicans only have rear view mirrors. So a synchronized global deflationary episode may yet get underway as China mines their great financial reserves for sufficiency. As the largest foreign holder of U.S. debt, they might have an influence on the availability of credit here at home. They want our technology, however, so we'll have to sell them a lot of innovation as things unfold. Let's get innovating.
Well, I won't claim my expertise in China's economy, but they seem to be doing very well. And I will just say that there was an expert on China's economy who, ever since, was it 96 or 97 at the Peterson Institute, who was predicting that they were going to have a financial collapse. And they still haven't had that yet.
That was Nicholas Lardy?
Nicholas Lardy, exactly.
Yeah, he was at Brookings before when he started this.
Okay,
theory.
and then he went to
Yeah.
the Peterson Institute. So,
Yeah.
so I'm a little hard-pressed. I mean, just the basic story is the country has enormous trade surplus, enormous reserves. So, again, I don't know the specifics. They may have a ton of non-performing loans, but the question I'd ask is, so what? Why couldn't they just, print up, $20 trillion worth of yuan? I mean, they could do that and paper it over. I don't know what would prevent them.
Yeah, they also control the state controls 60% of the banking system too, so they don't have that problem that we had, in trying to resolve the problems of the banking system by just, throwing taxpayer dollars at them. And so, yeah, I mean, their focus is on the real economy and the growth of the real economy, and had the fastest growth in the history of the world for, nearly 30 years now. And I really doubt that it's going to come down because some of their banks have not performing loans.
So Eureka Springs says, I would like to know if there are any solid numbers available for use in demonstrating how we can bring our troops home, apply stimulus, and employ a whole bunch of people in an endeavor to turn our economy energy green.
You can take that one.
Well, we certainly could bring our troops home. I mean, we're spending, the wars costing, the two wars, Afghanistan and Iraq, somewhere around, I think around $160 billion a year now. It's a good chunk of change. We're not really constrained, though, at the moment in terms of what we could spend. I mean, the important thing people have to understand, and this is hard because there's so much in the media going the other way, we really do want to spend money right now. So, if we could just snap our fingers and get the government to spend another $400 billion, that would be great, because we're not supply constrained. I mean, this is really actually orthodox economics. I mean, we're not supply constrained. Typically, we might think we are. Whether we are or not, I mean, it's at least a plausible argument. If you go back to 2000, we had 4% unemployment. Arguably, if then we said, okay, we want to spend another $200 billion, well, we're already pretty much at full employment. It would just create inflation. You can't tell that story today. So as much as I might think it'd be a good idea for us to get out of Afghanistan and Iraq, that's not what's limiting our ability to spend more money on a green economy. So we should be spending more money on a green economy, whether or not we got out of Iraq and Afghanistan, which we should do.
All right, so Dean, you write that we should have a financial transactions tax, but you also say raising taxes is not wise in a recession. Which one is it?
Well, we should get a financial transactions tax whenever we could get it, and if now's the time we could get it. It is being talked about now, and that's really a fantastic thing, because I thought this was a good idea for many, many years. And
that was the first thing we were working on when we started CEPR.
That's right. That's right. Actually,
that's our first grant.
Our first grant was to push that. That's right. And but it had always been a marginal idea, but you're getting a lot more interest in it now, because the basic logic, I mean, there's several things it does. First off, most obviously it discourages short-term trading. So, you have a lot of speculation that may make sense because you could do this very cheaply if you put in just very modest taxes. Speculation, buying something at 1 o'clock, selling it at 2 o'clock may not seem like such a good idea. Whereas for someone who's looking to hold stock, or, someone gets a future to protect their corn crop or whatever it might be, a very small tax of, in case of a future, maybe 1 or 0.02%, that really won't make a difference. So one is it stops speculation, or reduces speculation, I should say. Secondly, you just get enormous waste in the financial sector. Our financial sector has just been exploding relative to the size of the economy, so that if you just take sort of the narrowly defined financial sector, the securities, the commodities, that very narrowly defined sector, that's quadrupled as a share of GDP over the last 3 decades. So it'd be like, I always say, it'd be like if for the trucking industry, we currently employ like around 1 million people in trucking. Imagine we employ 4 million. I mean, I don't in the right mind go, why do you have such an inefficient trucking industry? That's where we are with finance, but no one says that. They should say that, but they don't. So if we had a tax like that, we would have, a more efficient financial sector. We'd get rid of a lot of the waste. And the third thing is you can raise a ton of money. So I did a paper with my friend Robert Poland at UMass about a decade ago, and we calculated then that you could raise about $100 billion a year. I'm sure it's at least 150 if we took the current trading numbers. So that's real money. Now, in terms of the downturn, if you taxed it, it does pull some money out of the economy. But again, a big plus of this is that most of that is from higher end people. So you're actually taking it from, the Bill Gateses of the world, who it's not going to affect their spending much anyhow. So, even though it'd be better to have the tax take effect after, we're out of the downturn, in 3 or 4 years, if we could get it today, I'd be very happy, and we could find some other, we could spend some money elsewhere to offset whatever drag it might be on the economy.
So, Mark, given that CEPR is one of the only think tanks that looks at Latin American economic growth, can you share with us how the economic crisis is affecting Latin America?
Yeah, well, it's hitting them some. It hit them later than it did, say, the United States. The countries that are hit the hardest are the ones that are most closely tied to the United States. Like Mexico, for example, projected to shrink 7% this year. Countries have been hit through trade, through remittances. Not so much, they didn't really buy up much of the toxic assets. I guess that was one advantage they had from having very high interest rates. Nobody cared about getting any of these AAA junk, AAA rated junk bonds in disguise. And so it is, I think it is demonstrating some of the things that we did warn about, that, for instance, over-dependence on the U.S. economy. For Mexico, the CAFTA countries, for example, Central America and Caribbean, that it was a bad thing. The countries that have diversified more in recent years or never had as much ties to the United States are doing better. Brazil, for example, has less than 1% of GDP trade with the United States, as compared to Mexico, which their trade with the United States, well, it's it's probably their exports to the United States are 70 or 80% of their exports. And their exports are maybe 35% of the economy. So that's huge. And then there's remittances and everything else. So basically, the basic story is that those who have the most trade with the U.S. and commercial relations with the U.S. are being hit the hardest. And those that are implementing some stimulus policies, some of them have made some difference as well.